have to make sure all my bings are off. Okay. So we're going to wait about 1 minute or so and then begin this. I see people coming on. Well, I suggest we begin. I'm sure people will be coming on because many know this, the introductory slides, having been participating in these sessions before. So first of all, I want to thank everyone for joining. I'm Barbara Bierer. I'm the faculty director of the MRCT Center and a professor of medicine and pediatrics at Harvard Medical School. This is one of a series of webinars that we are hosting in order to really explore how to increase inclusion in clinical research. We have these on the second Wednesday of every month at 11 a.m. Eastern Time, adjusted to your own time zone. And again, thank you for joining us. Could I have the next slide? As you all know, this discussion is closed captioned. Some of you will see a member of the panel, Captioner Denise. If you see that and need to, for some reason, connect with her, feel free, please, to chat to her. You can also increase the chat display size as you are seeing so that you can increase the font and make it more visually easier for you to see. We look forward to the fact that Zoom apparently is going to have closed captioning for as a general provision sometime in the fall. Could I have the next slide? So as you know, this is the standard disclaimer. We did much of this initial work in a project with the FDA and many affiliated organizations. The views that we're expressing today are those of the speakers, authors, and ourselves, and we serve in our individual capacity and don't represent our institution or affiliated organizations. We do receive voluntary contributions You can read that on the website from whom we receive gifts, and those are unrestricted gifts. We also have grants. Next slide, please. So we have done 2 series, or we're in the second series. The first series was really looking at a number of fundamental and foundational issues for increasing diversity and inclusion in clinical trials. That webinar series, all of the recordings and all of the slides are available to be both heard and downloaded respectively. You can see the topics there. And we invite you to visit our site and explore that content. It's rich. We spent the first 20 minutes or so on the MRCT recommendations, and then had 2 or 3 speakers speaking exactly to the context and how they had worked this into their organizational processes. Could I have the next slide? We are now in a driving inclusion in clinical research, and we have done 2 of these. We're on June 9th today. Those webinars, recordings, and slides are available from those 2 sessions earlier. I should say that this will be available also in about 2 days. Improving inclusion of persons with disabilities in clinical research. And next month, we're going to be talking about translation and the complexities of translation and how to think about that going forward so that we are inclusive of those who don't, whose primary language is other than English. Could I have the next slide? So as many of you know, and I'm not going to spend much time saying it, the MRCT Center is a research and policy center at Harvard and the Brigham and Women's Hospital. It's really dedicated to improving the ethics, conduct, and regulatory environment of global clinical trials with the aim of improving the integrity, safety, and rigor. And really, we do the work by pulling together diverse stakeholders to define emerging issues in these global clinical trials. We're not satisfied with just defining them. We then really work to take on the challenge of finding actionable and practical solutions. Could I have the next slide, please? So as many of you know, we finished about a 3-year project on defining and improving diversity, inclusion, and equity in clinical research. We published that version of our recommendations. I would suggest you don't try to print it. It is about 400 pages long, but it is available to you on the website, as well as now a dynamic website that parses much of the work that we've done. This really represents the work of about 50 different incredibly committed individuals from the kinds of organizations that you can read on the left, each serving in their individual capacity. And this was co-led by the FDA, by a psychiatrist, a cardiologist, academia, and industry with patients and patient advocates. Could I have the next slide, please? So today we're really going to be talking about inclusion of persons with disabilities. After a short introduction, I'm going to introduce our speakers in order. Michael Stein will be speaking. He's a professor at the Harvard Law School and the executive director of the Harvard Law School Project on Disability. We'll then turn to Tinamarie Duff, who is the global lead for People and Business Resource Group for DAWN. DAWN stands for Differently Abled Workplace Network at Bristol Myers Squibb. We're really delighted to have you here. We're also delighted to have you, Michael. I didn't say that. And then we're going to move to Julie Sowash, who's a guest speaker and the executive director of Disability Solutions, and a co-host of Crazy and the King podcast. And she really works with, in a nonprofit that brings a solution set to the exact problems we're discussing today. So could I have the next slide? So as all of you or many of you know, disabilities in the US and worldwide are a very common consideration. And the definition of who is disabled varies, and it varies fundamentally and importantly because it depends upon what that disability definition is going to be used for. Is it going to be used for disability benefits? Is it going to be used for providing accommodations? Is it something that we need to know for census reasons only, for providing general public accommodations or specific accommodations, or changing our behavior to be inclusive from the beginning? So we're not going to discuss these definitions, but we will use the one from the Center for Disease Control and Prevention, at least for now. And if you go to the next slide, that really is thinking about a disability is any condition of the body or mind, an impairment that makes it more difficult for the person with the condition to do certain activities, which is an activity limitation, and interact with the world around them, or participation restriction. Now, there are an innumerable different kinds of disabilities, such as people who are blind or have vision impairment, people who are hard of hearing or deaf, people who have different motor or physical movement disorders. Those can be chronic and persistent. They can be intermittent. They can be progressive. They can be temporary. Learning or comprehension. Some people require extra time. Some people, as you've heard, are visual learners, some auditory learners. They hear and can remember much better what they've heard than what they read. There's lots of different kinds of learning challenges. And then there are emotional, intellectual, interpersonal, or social challenges as well. So today we're really going to be talking about clinical trials, and clinical trials not directed at the specific disability, but rather at another sort of diagnosis, concern, condition. So obviously, if you're figuring out, let's say, a new hearing aid and comparing it to other hearing aids, you're going to have people who have difficulty hearing or are hard of hearing or have auditory challenges in that population. It's by definition who you should be studying. But the example we use is people who are have some other disability, let's say, is in a wheelchair or enabled by a wheelchair, comes in with breast cancer. Often they're not asked to be in a cancer clinical trial for no reason other than we just don't ask them. And similarly, we don't think about things like, how do we dose people who, have lost a limb? We know how to dose obese people. We've never even considered how to dose somebody who has all their organs, but not their body weight. So today we're going to speak about physical disabilities, that's vision, hearing, motor, physical movement. Less, although we'll mention learning and comprehension, cognitive and intellectually disabled, because we're going to come back to that. We've got a whole project working on that. And that's complicated in the clinical research context because it often involves the capacity to consent. And we didn't want to confuse the issues. The people we're talking about have capacity to consent in the context of this discussion today. Could I have the next slide? So in thinking about it, why aren't people asked? Well, so part of it is people are uncomfortable in the conversation. So if we ask, you know, how do you begin those conversations, we'd recommend that you think about an open question that allows an individual to respond, you know, and without making assumptions about that individual. Many of these limitations or disabilities we can't see. It's one thing if somebody, you know, comes in on crutches. It's another if it's an invisible disability. So to ask a question like, do you have any limitations that I should know about? And limitations may not be an easy word for people. So sort of thinking about saying explicitly, do you have any limitations or disabilities that might impact your participation in the research, is a good open question, because people will know if they have a disability and will feel invited to respond. And then asking a general question, which is, can we help make your participation easier in any way? It allows them the open gambit to respond in any way that's of concern or an issue. And you may hear about, you know, well, I need to care for my grandmother in the hours that you offer. It may not be about disability, but nevertheless, it is important that you and we prepare ourselves to allow that. And then, of course, you can follow with different types of questions depending on the research study. We do recommend that you adopt the principle of universal precautions, that is, asking everyone about their lived experience, whether or not you see a disability, whether it is evident or visible. It is the most equitable, considerate approach, and allows for the conversations that should be had. Could I have the next slide? Now, there are challenges with people sort of initially stumbling over how to address a disability in conversation. There is something called people first language, PFL, or person first language, where instead of saying that's a handicapped person or he's a quadriplegic, saying that that is a person with a disability or a person with quadriplegic, rather than defining them as their disability, defining them as a person who has a condition, as we all have different conditions. It's interesting because we talk about blinded clinical trials. How do people think about that who are blind indeed? So, it's also not without controversy. We're going to hear about that today. There are some people who believe and, that this is an important part of who they are and should be discussed explicitly and should be recognized explicitly. And that's okay. And not knowing how that person in front of you wants to be termed and wants to be referred to or not, it's a perfectly okay question to ask. How would you like me to discuss that with you? Could I have the next slide, please? So there's a lot of recommendations that we're putting together for you, and the people on this call have been instrumental in making sure that we consider different aspects of inclusion in clinical research. So explicitly asking about and providing information about accommodations. Ask who to contact, should accommodation be required. It is perfectly reasonable to solicit advice and recommendations from organizations and people dedicated to access and about the specific disability to which you wish to address. I think it's important to offer telemedicine, even though we have our challenges in the US, video conferencing and virtual visits is appropriate to really diminish the burden on not only people with disabilities and mobility challenges, but everyone. And those should be available in large print, health literate in plain language, which should be appropriately translated, as there are people who have limited English proficiency or are not English speaking by choice. And audible translation for individuals unable to read. There are also additional measures that we'll talk about to make written and oral language easier for people to understand. As we talked about, use person first language, and then use multiple formats for all communications. So visual, large formats, and alt text, etc. And then telecommunications, relay services, and assistive devices whenever possible. Please remain flexible and remain aware of your personal bias, as we all are becoming more comfortable recognizing that those biases are what makes us diverse, and we should bring those biases sort of forthright into the conversation so that we can address them together. Could I have the next slide? So there are a number of technology resources for common applications that we've pulled together here. I just want to mention it because it will be on the slides and available for download. Next slide. So with that as a brief introduction, let me go back now and ask for each of you to introduce yourself a bit more fully, and to take a few minutes, let's say 4 or 5, to discuss, sort of what brought you to this work and what you think we should learn about inclusion of people with disabilities in clinical research. And I think we can go on to gallery mode for the rest of this, as no one else has slides. Thank you. Maybe I could call on you, Michael. Ask you to begin.
Thank you, Barbara, and I'm delighted to be here today. I'm the executive director of the Harvard Law School Project on Disability, which all of our participants are welcome to visit at hpod.org, where you can find resources on disability rights advocacy, join our email list for attending our various webinars, find advocacy tools, videos, and other good fun stuff. As part of my job at HPOD, I've worked in over 44 different countries on the ground on various aspects of disability law and policy, including those relating to healthcare, to all aspects of equality. I was also one of the individuals who was fortunate enough to participate in the drafting of the UN Disability Human Rights Treaty. And I've been teaching disability law and policy, bioethics, and other related areas for approximately 30 years. So I'm actually even older than I look. I think the MRCT work is marvelous, and I was introduced to it by a dear colleague. And MRCT is to be congratulated on their findings and their dissemination of their findings. I would only pause for a moment and reiterate what Barbara has already acknowledged, which is this is kind of the fundamental basics to begin with. It's all very sensible, it's very logical, it's not adhered to widely and therefore is very needed. But the more complex and to me also academically interesting issues are those that are going to come on intellectual, cognitive, psychosocial, and other non-visually discernible disabilities. And I'm very thankful to Barbara for encouraging my participation as we go forward in investigating those. But I also pause to say that there isn't a bright line between the physical, easily or not so easily discernible, and those other ones. And during our prep, Julie had some very interesting things to mention in that regard, so I hope she'll come back to it, if only during questions and answers. Although I am a law professor, even if I don't play one on TV, I would note that from a strictly legal point of view, it should be obvious to those conducting clinical trials that they cannot discriminate against or exclude people with disabilities. This is both because of the Federal Rehabilitation Act, wherein any entity, by which we mean, say, Beth Israel Deaconess or Mount Auburn or any other hospital, receives any amount of federal funding, they are not allowed to discriminate in any respect against any individual in other aspects of their work with disabilities. And every hospital that I've ever known receives at least $1 somehow in federal grants or funding and are under that edict. There are also places of public accommodation, depending upon exactly what they're doing in their clinical trials and other work under the Americans with Disabilities Act, Title III. But I'd rather not focus on the legal obligations because one, just strictly putting out the stick is not very helpful towards eliciting compliance. We know that for many other areas of disability law and policy, in particular employment. And it doesn't change the culture of clinicians and clinical trials. So instead, I'd rather talk about the sociology or the enculturation of including disability within these clinical trials. And although I am someone who has written within the science and medical area about clinical bias, about dehumanization, about other areas of exclusion of people with disabilities, and it does happen, I also believe that it's not an overt conscious desire to exclude people with disabilities from these clinical trials. Instead, it seems very much parallel to me to the area of employment and disabilities, an area I've worked in for about 30 years, although Tinamarie will have very interesting things to point out there as well. And simply to state that when we look at the population base and we look at those who are participating at the end, whether it's clinical trials or employment or other areas, the numbers simply don't match up. And I'm not proposing a quota, but what I am proposing is that it's fairly basic in public health that we have a representative population in clinical trials and outcomes and treatments and all aspects. And when we don't, we usually raise a red flag. But we haven't been doing that for people with disabilities in many, many areas, including clinical trials. And I don't think that it's due to an overt bias, either by clinicians or in parentheses to employers, although sometimes it can be. I think rather it's a matter of the clinical managers and or the human resource managers having many options as to who to be part of either the workforce or the clinical trial subset population and figuring, well, why should I have to bother with X when she is going to require an accommodation when I could just as easily fill the slot, meaning someone who's appropriately qualified, who doesn't add these other issues. That's where I think it's happening. So the recommendations from MRCT, I think, are enormously helpful. It's also enormously helpful to step back for a moment and consider that we accommodate people because we come in different sizes, shapes, flavors, religions, races, genders, etc., all the time. And we do it as a matter of course, whether it is, the nicotine addict who will need to take a break from various activities, or the single parent, or the individual not related to anything of their own, but to their family or other environmental affects, who need some help or need to do things slightly differently. And yet we've become very enculturated in society to think about that as the normal course of business. And I don't mean literally business, I mean clinical trials as well. But yet when it comes to disability, it's something that old friend Kathy Martinez would refer to as coming off a specialty shelf. It's a matter of compliance, or it's a matter of being a pain in the rear, or it's a matter of going the extra mile, whereas we don't think about that in the other groups. The other thing that I will throw out and get out of the way before the other panelists is that there's also the idea that people with disabilities who have done enormous work in their advocacy, and that's most of what my day is directed towards, do not ordinarily occupy the clinical area in the respect that if they are being excluded from a particular development, say, of a drug for their particular impairments, they're angry about it and vocal, and rightly so. If they're being overtly excluded from various neutral, quote unquote, standards, as we saw during the crisis standards of care, right, with COVID emergency care, or in being deprioritized or lesser prioritized in terms of vaccines, then they make noise, and rightfully so, and very often can affect change. But in the normal course of events of hospital ethics committees, IRBs, clinical trials, this is not a space that people with disabilities and the representative organizations as yet have occupied or have yet turned their attention to in great detail. That could be because our population, say here in the US and elsewhere, has a lot more on their plate regarding urgency, or it could be just a lack of enculturation. But I wonder what including people with disabilities, both in clinical trials and in those broader policy areas, would do as far as the outcomes and the standards and how we go forward in thinking about what is required, what is accepted, and what is acceptable. So thank you very much for having me. I look forward to interacting with you during our Q&A.
Thank you, Michael, for that really compelling discussion. Let me turn to Tinamarie. Maybe you could introduce yourself and say something about how a large organization such as yours has approached this.
Sure. So my name is Tinamarie Duff. I'm a middle-aged Caucasian woman. I'm sitting with long brown hair in a white blazer. So thank you for having me. So I became interested in disability advocacy and business initiatives as a result of my nephew's diagnosis of spinal muscular atrophy in 2007. This led me to becoming a founding member of an organization called All Wheels Up, which was and still the only global organization that's conducting crash testing and research for wheelchair tie downs and advocating for accessible commercial airline flights. While I was doing that, I have been working at Bristol Myers Squibb for 22 years in various roles, mostly in the oncology space. And currently I'm the global lead for Bristol Myers Squibb, our disability-focused resource group. It's my full-time job. I report to the Chief HR Officer. I'm responsible for the strategic planning of disability inclusion programming and initiatives globally. There's about 2,300 members right now across 4 continents, all with a single purpose of fostering an environment and a workplace culture that promotes the value of individuals with disabilities and their contributions to the company's mission of helping our patients prevail over serious disease. Disability is part of my lived experience, having a cancer diagnosis in 1994, along with a little annoying heart condition and an occasional struggle with PTSD. I have a child with dyslexia and dysgraphia, and I'm also the daughter of an alcoholic who unfortunately died from his disease this past April. So there's a lot of things that Michael said that, I echo, and I'm looking forward to the conversation because one of the points that I think we'll get to is what has also held back the disability community in its advancements, not only in employment, but also in areas like clinical trials and health equity and medical outcomes. And really, since the ADA was passed 31 years ago, what we're looking at right now is an entire generation that has grown up with accommodations, IEPs, 504s, and have come to expect, as well as they deserve, support for the disabilities to remove barriers to allow for equal access and participation. This includes and should include, clinical trials. People with disabilities are one of the largest dimensions of diversity. So I think it's important that we intentionally, and I put emphasis on the word intentionally, make the effort to expand the conversation of diversity to go beyond the traditional definitions that were mentioned earlier, and look at ways to create processes that include the inclusion of people with disabilities in clinical trials. It makes for better science. It makes for better safety data that has more integrity. It also allows it to be reflective of the real world, where we're looking at 1 out of 5 people have a disability. It's ethical. Healthcare needs to work for all, and I think clinical trials is a big part of that step in that process. So thanks for having me. This is going to be very exciting to hear from everybody.
Thank you, and thank you for introducing yourself. in that way. I am also a white elderly woman in a white striped shirt. Julie?
Hi, thank you, everyone. I'm so happy to be here and so happy to be batting cleanup for Michael and Tinamarie. My name is Julie Sowash, and I am the Executive Director of Disability Solutions. We are a national nonprofit that works to build brand structure, process, systems, and cultures that are inclusive of people with disabilities. Over the past 5 years, I have been privileged to work with 50 plus brands as a direct extension of their talent acquisition, their hiring, their culture, and their DEI. I'm lucky enough and privileged enough to work with Tinamarie every day. And really what has resulted in that is several thousand people with disabilities being hired, people being retained, and about 10,000 now, I think, managers, people leaders being trained on how to better include people with disabilities as they think about growing in leadership positions. I am also a person who has a disability. I live with, I'm neurodiverse technically, as well as living with multiple mental illnesses. And I was not properly diagnosed as neurodiverse until I was about the age of 30. Which fundamentally not just changed my life, but also saved my life, because I was able to get to a place where I could manage my mental illnesses in a way that I wasn't able to before, because I didn't know what was the underlying cause. And so I am a huge advocate for being able to be our full selves, being able to bring our full selves to work and into clinical trials. And I think, you know, fundamentally, I always say I'm a person with a disability, even though some people might think I have a chronic condition, or they might rather call me neurodiverse. I'm a part of one of the largest communities in the world. And I am proud to be a part of this community. And I have privileges, because those disabilities are hidden when I choose to reveal them and when I choose not to reveal them. And I recognize that. But I also think, as someone who has a platform, I have a responsibility to speak out for people who can't speak for themselves and to be a representative of our community. And I think in closing, as we get to questions, because I'm so excited about this conversation, I think about our mission at Disability Solutions, which is really to change minds and change lives. And what I'm hoping is going to happen here is that we're going to have some conversation that's going to start to think about, or start to change some of your minds about better inclusion for people with disabilities, not just in clinical trials, but in your everyday life and in your places of employment. And I think I disagree a little bit with Michael, if I can start the first controversy of the webinar. I think that ableism is a fundamental part of our society. I think that it is both overt and very subtle at times. And ableism, in case you don't know, it's really the belief or bias that the able-bodied are superior to all, and that the world is built for them. And that results in the systemic dehumanization and devaluation of an entire population. And being 30 years after the ADA, and we're still having conversations about people with disabilities that are completely surrounded by risk and law, is not an inclusive conversation. And so as we're thinking about how do we start to have inclusive conversations, how do we start to get rid of those biases that we all have, and we know that they're there, to recognize that and to start to remove them from our systems, but also from our behaviors. So happy to be here, really privileged, and look forward to a great chat.
That's terrific. So Michael, do you want to respond, or you want to just simply say thank you?
We don't disagree. I mean, I've been teaching disability and justice for 30 years. And we talk about ableism, not only in regards to people with disabilities, but the notion of what is considered the mainstream acceptable body type. white, male, Christian, heterosexual, of European descent, and so on, as excluding all sorts of body types that don't fit that, some of which is more overt, some of which is more subtle. But I still believe, despite unconscious bias, which I write about in the clinical area, I still think and try to believe and go forward in thinking that healthcare providers are trying to act in their best faith when they interact with individuals with disabilities. They are at somewhat of a disadvantage because they're not educated as part of ableism, as part of their medical education, right? Or as part of their clinical education, or as part of their specialization regarding people with disabilities. I think the last study from AAMC points out something like 30 minutes during a 4-year medical school degree. But I try to think about them as potential human rights agents for change.
Thank you. So maybe I could go back to the issue of inclusion of persons with disability in clinical trials. And just to ask, for someone from a pharmaceutical company, Tinamarie, what do you see the benefit of that? I mean, it's not the issue in the way that we're working on it today. It's not the issue being studied. It's not like we're powering a scientific question around that. So what's the value proposition, number one, and then how do we dig in to do it?
Yeah, so you're right. So historically, we don't have data on people with disabilities in clinical trials because we're not measuring that. We're not collecting that area. But if you look at the numbers in your intro, you mentioned the data from the WHO or the CDC, that shares that it's a global 1 billion community. When you dive down a little deeper, and you look at US, so US, we have 61 million Americans living with a disability. And the intersectionality could be a great attribute to clinical trials, right? Right now, the buzzwords and everybody's speaking about how do we get more inclusion of Black Americans, Latino Americans, and so forth in clinical trials. Well, if we are citing data that was adapted from the FDA drug trial snapshot summary report from like 2015 to 2019, it shows that Black Americans represent 13% of the US population, but only about 4% participate in clinical trials. When you look into the disability community, 1 out of 4 individuals with a disability are part of the Black American population. Same thing with the Hispanic. When you look at the Hispanic data, 16% of the US population is part of the Hispanic community, but only approximately 3% participate in clinical trials. But as part of the disability community, you're looking at 1 out of 6 individuals. So right there, just by creating a process, and I hope we get to talk about this, a sustainable, permanent end-to-end process that looks at how clinical trials are designed, how people physically get to a clinical trial, how it's executed and recorded and reported and managed all the way through. Just by creating a process that is intentionally inclusive of people with disabilities, that is built for all rather than accommodations and exceptions, we would diversify the representation of the population within a clinical trial that is more reflective of the real world population.
Interesting. So, so the big question is then, how do we build that end-to-end solution and make it part of the process from the beginning so it's not exceptional in the way that I think we'd all advocate? So maybe I could ask Julie to start thinking and sort of educating about how do you approach an end-to-end solution for something as complicated as this?
It's a great question. And fortunately enough, it's what my team gets to do every single day. Some of the very complex multi-system activities and vendors that are part of talent acquisition, I think is a great place to look at. right? So how does a person learn about a job? How does a person apply for a job, get assessed for that job, and then moved all the way through to onboarding and then retaining them? That is a system and process that can be broken down into steps and managed within that system to be able to do two things. One is provide the data, right? And obviously, I think one of our fundamental problems right now is that we need to have more data for potential participants of clinical trials and understand why people are excluded and included, and then further down the line about their disability type. And one of the things that I can say most definitely that I've learned over the past 10 years of being a part of this community is that the approach to disability is always one-off. It's always a person needs to ask for an accommodation, a person needs to ask for a modification. We don't integrate and include as a part of design. And if we don't do that, right, that system is the fundamental ableist piece that's keeping people from participating. And so we have to start with that system change and acknowledge that that system has not been inclusive, and that the only way to make it inclusive is to start end to end. And Tinamarie has some great examples of very specific things that are actionable. For me, it is the end-to-end system that we have to tear down and decide what are those things that are keeping people from participating, that are just because they've always been done that way, or because we're not designing universally. One thing I was reading this morning as I was kind of prepping for our conversation is that of 400 clinical trials reviewed by Stanford, that over half of them were auto-excluded people with mental illness or a depressed state, right? We're not talking about serious mental illness in this case. We're talking about someone like me. I would be unable to participate in a clinical trial. And in psychiatric drugs, people with mental illness were excluded 100% of the time. And so, as confusing as that is in and of itself, is that there are common templates and functions of clinical trials that we've always had and we've always put into place. We have to start by changing those and then building the rest to make sure that they are inclusive and accessible, so that we're minimizing the accommodations and modifications on the other side that do cause someone to say, I really don't want to make the extra effort to work with that person. If we're designing inclusively, those cases will be minimized and we'll be able to be more responsive to those that we do need to accommodate.
Yeah, and just to support that point, we have argued now that whenever there is inclusion or exclusion criteria, it should be scientifically or ethically based. So we don't want to burden, people inappropriately or in a discriminatory way, but we also need to make sure we don't inadvertently exclude people for reasons of using these sort of patterns or block and copy inclusion exclusion criteria from our last trial. But I don't usually see things that say, you'll be excluded if you have a physical disability or a visual or a hearing impaired. I mean, it just doesn't come up. So how do we guard against that? What do we do? Tinamarie, you look like you're about to speak.
Yeah, so no, I was going to add on, and you just kind of also led me right there, Barbara. So I can give you an example. I know a story of a gentleman who was missing a limb, and because of the inclusion exclusion criteria of the clinical trial, he did not meet the body mass index or the weight requirement for a clinical trial that he should have been able to participate in, without, regardless of the missing limb, and when you think about how you're building that process, to add on to what Julie was saying, at Bristol Squibb, our clinical trial diversity team, our objective is to improve recruitment of diverse patients, right, in clinical trials, ensuring that the population, as we talked about, is more reflective of the real world, right, and also aligns with the epidemiology of the disease being studied. And a couple of the fundamental or foundational approaches is, aligning with health, enterprise health equity initiatives and sustainability objectives, and anchoring in activities in a formal process, striving for permanence, right, with the hope that the projected outcome is really the increase of the inclusion of people with disabilities, and also accelerated innovation and development of our transformative medicines. And when you think about the impact of having a really truly diverse population, what can be learned, I think that part of innovative, jumps out at me. The next iteration of that, when I take it to specifically looking at the disability community, is to move that process upstream, right, in the design from onset. And there's a myth, there's a thought that accessibility or accommodations is expensive. Quite often it's not. It's low cost or it's free. And some examples, Julie teed me up for was, you can wear see-through. And this is something we're doing at Bristol Myers. We have see-through face masks that support our lip reading community. You can build your patient portals from the beginning to WCAG, which is Website Content Accessibility Guidelines standards. So those that are using assistive technology can find the clinical trials, can participate in the clinical trials. So the other piece is diagnostic medical equipment. And it's kind of shocking when you look at really what the data says out there as far as the ability of offices and physicians and to have diagnostic medical equipment. And we talked about it yesterday, Barbara, in the prep for this, and you alluded to it. If you cannot accurately weigh somebody who is a user of a wheelchair, how do you properly dose the medication? Right? And I think that's a great example. So, there are definitely things that are low cost. It is a mindset. And to echo what Michael said, it's about educating and having an awareness. So I think a part of my job is the education piece. And if you're not living with a disability and it doesn't impact you, you may not consider the impact of not having captioning on an audience that maybe English isn't the first language, or maybe they're part of the deaf and hard of hearing community. So, I echo a lot of the thoughts, but really what I want people to think about is it's not as problematic or expensive or troublesome when you're building for and with the community, not for us, without us from the onset.
And if I could just add one thing, which is one of the pillars I think that we've been missing in this discussion is having clinicians with disabilities. And the AMC report was very good on that 2 or 3 years back. I recently published on it in EJAM about clinicians with psychosocial disabilities. But both having those clinicians who themselves identify as and are concerned about individuals with disabilities being included in the larger public health debate, programming, etc., is essential, as well as not only for the clinical work directly and what emanates from them, but also for their classmates and their schoolmates and the people they're in rotations with and the people that they serve with. Being able to see the population, interact with them, be familiar, know that some of us are more advanced in our development as people than others, right? Some of us, like me, still have lots of challenges on that. But the idea that we interact and we we enculturate and we become familiar with the group needs to be, I think, part of the thinking as well.
Really interesting. So, now that we are having this conversation, I don't think this is really, we don't collect data on disability in clinical trials. So how do we know we're doing poorly? Michael, you said, because if you look at the population and then you look at the people who have, volunteered to be in the trial, there's a disconnect. I don't think we know that. Do we know that? And how would we know that? Would it benefit us, or would it, or, or would it sort of force people who may not want to disclose for some reason to feel like they were, sort of needed to disclose? Two questions there. One, how do we know the data? And two, how do we make sure that is appropriately positioned?
Well, it's a catch-22, isn't it, with disability and stigma? We see that across all fields and all parts of society, that the very stigmas that subordinate people with disabilities cause them or allow them to, when they can, either not to disclose or to cover their disability. So your point's well taken that we may in fact have a larger percentage, because we're not actually keeping the data, or have a larger incidence than we recognize. But at the end of the day, the economists say, if you're not counted, you don't count. And creating an environment, as my two colleagues here have said, of it being an open, non-judgmental, embracing situation of self-disclosure within an anonymized or otherwise data set, and making it clear why it's important, is one of the ways forward. And I wish to leave them the rest of the time in our hour, but we see a very big difference in self-disclosure in incidences where an employer or a government or otherwise says, you must tell me if you have the following. And with disability, we see a slightly different response than we do in race, although now that we're more savvy about multiple forms of race, nationality, et cetera, we're seeing somewhat of a kickback on it. But we see a much more positive thing when we say, we'd like you to self-disclose if you have the following. And the reason for it is, one, we're under a federal obligation, and two, we'd like to be able to support you and attach all the goodies and all the positive things that go with it. It's not magic, but I think it is a step forward.
I would agree. And the rule in my life is, if it doesn't get measured, it doesn't get done. And so we have to be able to find the appropriate data collection points and the appropriate data collection methods, because we can't know, right? I think I agree with Michael that we know that there is large scale exclusion of people with disabilities, but we can find out where it happens, why it happens, when we have a system that's built to be permanent and sustainable in the course of how our trials are built. And that way will allow us to develop more inclusive trials. And, the fact of the matter is, I think to Michael's point, is as long as people with disabilities are seen as a risk and something that you have to mitigate, there's no value to me as a person who has a hidden disability to disclose that. And in fact, if I know I'm going into a clinical trial, that if I say I'm taking medications for XYZ, or I've been in a depressed state, that I will get excluded. So I'm going to hold that information back. And as clinicians, we want that data right out of the gate, so that we can make sure that we're getting the best possible outcomes for the entirety of our population and in our trials.
And so a question from the audience, and I'm going to ask this and then also ask you to make any closing thoughts for what we should take home and do better tomorrow than we do today. But the question here is, at what point in the research should we ask participants to disclose that information? Because they may feel, that we're excluding them if they don't get in for other reasons. And so that's the first thing. And the second thing is, if you want to leave the audience with one message or messages to think through in how they approach their work in all the different capacities in which they live, work, and what would you suggest? Should we go in reverse order this time? Julie?
Be thoughtful and be intentional, and build it from the beginning. If you build it from the beginning and you take away the opportunity for change, you're going to see a dramatic increase in people's ability to participate and to get access to the healthcare and drugs that they need to live the best possible life that is capable.
Thank you. Tinamarie?
I was going to leave with one takeaway. It's to move from ally to an advocate. An advocate takes action. An advocate affects change. Advocate says something, asks questions, and pushes the agenda forward, which is something the disability community really needs to do, is align as one disability community of access for all. And I think advocates can help.
Thank you. Thank you. Really moving. Michael?
I would encourage people to think in parallels so that, when I'm talking about disability, maybe you're thinking about race, gender, sexuality, nationality, because at the end of the day, we really have more in common as humans than we have that separates us as humans. And if we can empathize with each other and see ourselves and others, I think we're a lot better off as a we society than a me society. And that goes well beyond clinical trials.
Well, and with that, I want to thank everyone, with the that have contributed to the work as well as to this discussion today. There are some questions that we will follow up with the folks that asked them that we didn't have time today. And I just want to thank you all, not only for spending the hour together, but for the work you do every day and in your lives to make this a better place for all of us. Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.